Hello there, it's Andy Parks from the Washington Times, and I'll be joined momentarily by Stephen Dinan, Washington Times Assistant Managing Editor. Did you know, as a listener to my podcast, you can qualify for a 50% discount on an annual digital subscription to the Washington Times? Yep, all you have to do is go to washingtontimes.com/Andy. That's washingtontimes.com/ANDY. All right, ladies and gentlemen, here he is, Washington Times Assistant Managing Editor, Stephen Dinan. Hello, Stephen.
Hello, Andy.
DHS Chief Mayorkas, I give myself an A for effort, but if I'm reading one of your follow-up stories, that's not exactly what some sheriffs are saying about his performance.
It's not what the sheriffs are saying, and it's not what a number of members of Congress are saying. So this is during testimony to the Senate Judiciary Committee. Mayorkas was asked by Senator Lindsey Graham, always great time for questions. Lindsey Graham said, "So, here we are, 9 months or so, 8 months into your tenure. What do you give yourself?" And Mayorkas says, "I'm a really tough grader. I give myself an A for effort." And then he said, "at least on workforce issues." And then the conversation got derailed from there. But so there, A for effort was his, after saying he's a tough grader, announced that the A for effort. Later in that same hearing, Senator Kennedy from Louisiana sort of, poking fun at Mayorkas a little bit, and another Republican senator like Graham poking fun at Mayorkas, said, "Look, I don't think you're the guy who should be here answering questions about immigration, because I don't think you're actually in charge. I think you're basically doing, the White House is making all these decisions. So I don't know why you're the guy here having to face our questions. They should be the ones facing it." And Mayorkas was very indignant at that and said, "First of all, I'm thrilled to be a member of the president's cabinet, and I'm the one who should be held accountable for the immigration decision." And it's quite an invitation, given how awful the immigration situation is right now. But as you mentioned, almost contemporaneous with Mayorkas grading himself A for effort, the Western States Sheriffs Association, these are sheriffs that cover 17 states out west of the U.S., issued a statement declaring no confidence in Mayorkas and saying, and this was a really catching phrase, they said that he has reduced the border to nothing more than an invisible line in the sand.
Okay, now he also had to admit that the Afghan evacuees weren't put through a rigorous screening. Do we know how many? And I also understand now that one of the locations has been closed that has been putting these people through.
That's right. So there were 8 U.S. military bases here on American soil that were open to receive about 70,000 Afghan evacuees. And the first of those, the first that was ever set up, was Fort Lee in Virginia. And Fort Lee is now the first to have been emptied out and closed down. They basically have processed and released everybody from the several thousand people who had been stationed there. They've finally processed them all and released them. The other 7 are still open. All told, out of the 70,000 people that were evacuees that were brought to the U.S., 25,000 of them across all 8 of the installations have already been processed and released. There's still 45,000 more waiting for their turn. So, plenty more to go, and 7 more installations to close. But you put your finger on something that's really, really important about this. We're 3.5 months after the airlift operations ended, and we're finally starting to get certainty and some concrete information about who's there, and in particular the processes that were used to bring them. We were told all along, the administration kept saying rigorous, so much so they said they're basically getting the same sort of screening that refugees get, and refugees are subjected to the highest level of screening of any category of new arrival or visa applicant. There are a whole bunch of reasons for that. They have to be recommended to the U.S. generally. They go through an in-person interview overseas, where a trained officer listens to their story. This is an officer who's trained both in fraud detection and is supposed to be trained in the country conditions, so that they're able to say, okay, I know that area, that doesn't sound right, and flag something for further review or to reject the application. That interview is a really important part of that refugee process. It turns out that interviews were not a standard part of the process before Afghan evacuees got to the U.S. Some of them were given interviews only after they were flagged by the database checks. But if you went through the database checks and nothing came back that said, oh, we have some questions about this guy, then you never got an in-person interview. The issue with Senator Josh Hawley raised is, okay, that means that our checks are only as good as our data. And we're talking about people in Afghanistan who they may have been involved in all sorts of activities. We don't have access to Afghanistan's criminal databases anymore. And, so unless they had a crime that they'd committed here in the U.S. or one of our international partners, say Interpol has flagged, or they had engaged in enough terrorist activity that they'd come to the attention of the U.S. overseas, they would not be in those databases. So there's a large group, we don't know how many, but there's a large possibility that there are people who are bad actors who would have been spotted by an in-person interview, but that in-person interview never took place because they didn't have data in American databases.
All right, border chaos continued in October with record-setting arrest. Was this really a surprise?
It's not a surprise, but it is striking. And the reason it's striking is because this is the next straight month. The Biden administration has seen record apprehensions of illegal immigrants. October was actually less than August and September. So it was the third straight month where the actual overall numbers ticked down. Okay, that sounds good. The problem is that October is usually a very quiet month. I went back through the records, more than 20 years of records, and the highest previous total I could find for the month for Border Patrol arrests was about 100,000. Usually it hovered somewhere between 40 and 60,000. There were 159,000, 160,000 arrests the Border Patrol made this time in this last October. So it's supposed to be a quiet month. It was still absolute chaos on the border, and that's not good news for this administration. We began this year with them telling us this is a seasonal surge. It happens every year, and it will go away. And here we are 9 months after that assurance. It has not gone away. It's clearly not a seasonal surge, and it still does not appear that they have a solution to what's going on.
All right, the headline reads, "We are your base." Activists warn Democrats of election losses without full amnesty in budget. Looks like the Democrats may not need the activists if the election results from a couple of weeks ago mean anything.
Meaning that they're in trouble no matter what.
Yeah.
Democrats are in a tricky position here. They have to worry. There are several key interest groups, including the immigrant rights activists, who are desperately watching this. And, the climate activists are watching it. They're sort of split on what they think about it. The abortion rights activists are watching it, but they want to see the Hyde Amendment language that has generally protected taxpayers from having to fund abortion services through federal tax money. That's generally prevented that. The abortion rights activists are looking for that language to disappear in here. And the immigrant rights activists are looking for a big step towards legalization of 11 million illegal immigrants. Some of those groups are going to be disappointed. And as you said, it remains to be seen just how angry the activist groups will be. For what it's worth, of course, we go through this every 2 years where the Hispanic rights groups and the immigrant rights groups say, hey, you need to pay attention to us this time around, or we're not going to turn out for you Democrats. They generally do turn out for Democrats. It's sort of funny. I love covering this because there's heading into the election, there are these dire warnings. We're not going to turn out because you guys weren't nice enough. You need to be nicer to us. And then after the election, the exact same groups are saying, see, when Democrats do win, they say, see, we delivered victories to you. It was us that did it, even though the Democrats didn't deliver on the promises of Hispanic rights groups. So you can consider this just some more warnings that aren't really important in the grand scheme of things. But the one caveat to all that is that the Democrats have so raised expectations about what they can do now that they control all the levers here in Washington. And that's why I mentioned the other groups, the abortion rights groups and the climate activists, the young college students and young adults who want free college tuition and loan forgiveness. There are a lot of folks who believed Democrats were going to finally be able to deliver on these promises that Democrats have made over the decades. And a lot of that, the college stuff is not in here. And if the immigration stuff disappears, you certainly will have a number of folks who begin to wonder why show up at all. they didn't deliver. They promised and they didn't deliver. It's, Republicans faced this when they promised to repeal Obamacare and didn't succeed in a full repeal of Obamacare. There was a sense that, well, maybe Republican voters won't be happy with that. So Republicans suffered defeats in the 2018 House right after they were unable to repeal Obamacare. Some analysts will certainly draw a connection between those two.
Folks, you can read all of Stephen Dinan's stories at WashingtonTimes.com. Stephen, as always, thank you.
My pleasure, Andy.
Washington Times Assistant Managing Editor, Stephen Dinan. Thanks for joining me today, and remember to receive a 50% discount on an annual digital subscription to the Washington Times. Go to WashingtonTimes.com/Andy. You'll get 24/7 digital access to the Washington Times at 50% off. Again, go to WashingtonTimes.com/ANDY. I'm Andy Parks. Have a great day.